Okay, today it is my privilege and honor to introduce and talk with Michael Hettich, formerly a Miami resident who now lives in North Carolina, Black Mountain area. Michael has so many books, I can't even begin to name them for you. He's got 19 altogether. And today we're going to be talking about his newest book, The Halo of Beads. So, Michael, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm doing really well. Thank you for interviewing me, and thank you, Michael, for Michael Amara for hosting this whole thing. I mean, you're hosting it, but for recording it, it's a privilege to be here, and it's really nice to talk to you.
Terrific. All right, we're going to have a conversation um, about your book. And because we know each other, this should be really easy.
Yes.
Um, I do have a question. When I first got your book, I always look at the front matter and I look at the design, and I noticed that in the front matter, it lists your 12 other books, but I know you have more than that. You actually have 7 chapbooks, and they weren't listed in the front
Right.
matter, and I was curious why.
I think the reason for that was because I did not include any poems from those books, so I left them off the list, and particularly the first
Huh,
two. My first two books were not. I had nothing. I was not proud of any of the poems in those books, so I left them off the list. And as far as the other ones, I don't know. I think I got them all on there, but maybe I didn't. I'm not sure. And if I didn't, it would have been a little chapbook or something like that. So yeah.
right. I was wondering if publishers or if you didn't consider a chapbook a book. So those,
Maybe I don't know if I do. I don't know about and I don't know what anybody else thinks. I think of them as small, let's say, chapters from a book or sections from a book that I really like a lot because they give you a chance to read. You sit down and read the whole thing at once, and you get a sense of an arc of development that sometimes is lost in a full book because you put the book down and then you get back into it, and don't quite
right.
hear it the way you heard the first time. So I really
Right.
like them.
And a chapbook is a small
And
taste that you
another thing
get.
I like about chapbooks is I love the fact that many chapbooks are beautifully produced. Letterpress and handmade paper and things like that. I just really like that. I think that goes really well with poetry too.
It
So
does. It does. I agree. Okay, let's get with the book. I
yeah,
noticed the first poem in the book, Core, and I thought that was such an interesting poem. I'm going to have you read it. And then I want to know why you chose to open this magnificent collection with this poem, Core.
okay,
So would you like to read that for us?
yeah. Let me read it to you. Okay, core. The hawk in the white pine shivers, hunched into itself like a state of being we might think had vanished if we'd been playing too long with our gadgets or making arrangements to assure our perfect happiness sometime in the future. The wind that tossed cut down trees remains a ghost inside our furniture, like the antique notion of a soul. And ancient tides drew the swirls and the stones that line our paths, scars that mark the seasons our ancestors lived, etched like tree rings into the secrets we don't even know we're keeping, a dream that woke us to forget, a blue that dazzles the sky as only nothing can do in the morning. Okay, so that's a hard poem to read. I think that's the first thing to say about it. I like reading it. I've been reading it actually as the opening poem for my readings for the book, but it's a very difficult poem to read because there are a lot of nuances in terms of the tone of the shifts, the line breaks that shift the tone in the poem are very difficult to carry in a reading. I think they come across better read on the page, honestly. But I also find the cadences and rhythms in the poem to be interesting. I mean, I like the way the poem moves, and I'm proud of the way it moves. but I do find that reading it doesn't bring it across the way I'm always hoping it would come across. And as to the reason I chose it as the first poem in the book, I think there are a number of reasons, but really perhaps the primary reason is that the editor at Press 53, the poetry editor, Chris Forrest, who's a wonderful editor, really a real privilege to work with, he thought that the book would start really well if I used a poem that was in a way not inscrutable or difficult, but was challenging in a certain way and opened up certain kinds of possibilities that might have been impossible to suggest by a more let's say easy to understand poem. They would perhaps have a clear theme that would, that one would want to see developed through the book. So I agree with him. It's a kind of an anomalous poem for me, at least in this stage of my life, of my writing. But I thought that it opened up the book well because it's kind of an environmentally focused poem and a poem that thinks about technology and the ways we are not present in our own lives, which is exactly what poetry, I think, needs us to, asks us, brings us to in our lives, a greater presence. So I think that's why I started it, and I also have to say that putting a book together for me is always an intuitive process of, does this poem go with that one, or does it sing well? Does it rhyme well with the one next to it? And I just go through them and through them and through them, put them together, rearrange them until there's a certain arc that I could not, I think, explain to a reader, but it just feels right. And then what happens to me after that is that the title for the book becomes clear or suggests itself, and then I think the whole book starts to fall together. So this poem just felt like the first poem in the book. You know,
Was it the first poem in your original manuscript that you submitted to the publisher?
I think it might have been. I'm not really sure. I don't remember. Um, it might have been, but I do want to say that as far as the new poems in this book went, I had many poems that I took out, and then others. It's kind of almost a chapbook length collection. I think I don't know how long it is actually, but it's not a full book, but almost 34 pages. So that's
Yeah,
a good chapbook. I just wasn't sure what to include in that length book, given the fact that it's a new and selected poems collection. So Chris helped me a lot with that.
oh,
So
terrific. I think a
yeah.
lot of people, writers, those of us who would be watching this interview, uh, love to know how you put a book together. Do you print out all the pages and then physically manipulate them? Do you
Uh,
do it all on the computer?
yeah.
Do you paste them up around the walls?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nick Flynn did that in a workshop. He had us put all of our pieces on the wall
Yeah.
and then move things around. So, so how do
How do
you
I
do
do
that?
it? Well, it's funny because I'm a very non-computer type of person, like, in general. But in terms of poetry, I do my writing on the computer, and I think my initial organization for any book, almost to the very end, is done on my computer. And okay, so as I do that, I read through the book and feel like, where is the what how does one poem illuminate the weaknesses or strengths or light in another one, and that allows me to either take out poems, to fit, revise lines, do things with them as they fit in the structure of the or don't fit in the overall structure of the book. And I go over it and over it quite, a lot. And then eventually I print it out. And then again, I read it, not really aloud, because I can hear very well without reading aloud. A lot of people read aloud, but I have a sense of how it sounds just by reading silently. And then I just keep going, and I keep going until I feel like I have something that represents what I'm trying to get at in that particular book. And another thing for me is, over the years, I'm I'm always aware when I finished a book in my compositional process. What I mean by that is I'm not sure of the book itself, but I know that I'm done with a particular passage of time and a particular passage of writing, and I need to go on to something else now. Whatever themes and obsessions and interests were making those poems, were in those poems, were central in those poems, has changed. And so I have maybe 70 poems or more, and I just go through them and try to sing, allow them to sing together to the point that I come to understand what they're about, and I come to understand what I've been thinking about or feeling as I've gone through that passage of time. And then, I'd keep wrestling with those particular poems until I feel like I have something good. And then, whatever, I always hope that I get a publisher who is going to say, yeah, that's a good book, but it needs us to think about these things. And I love the collaborative process of working with a good editor. Uh, and sadly, I think that's getting rarer and rarer. I think a lot of times publishers publish books that just come as they come to them, without applying the
Yeah,
necessary pressure that really makes the book work. So,
right. Yeah, I've never had an editor suggest a different order or anything. What's really great about Word using, computer programs like that is that we can put up 4 pages at a time, and we can do it in book format, so we can see how the page
yeah.
turns and what it's going to look like. So that, yeah, that helps a lot.
But I
Um,
have to say, really, I really, really think my central way of working on the order of poems in a book is pretty much intuitive. I mean, it's not, I don't put them up
right.
like that. I kind of just have a sense of it, and I either trust it or I don't trust it. And then when I get to the point where I trust it all, okay, that's a good stopping place for now.
Yeah, I do that too. The only thing
Yeah,
I put it up is if I want a poem that's 2 pages long, I want to
yeah.
be sure that it's on facing pages so you don't have to turn the page
Oh,
to
yeah, I
read the
know.
second.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
yes, so I
yeah.
do work like that.
That's another thing
But yeah,
a good editor does. A good editor will
yeah,
make sure that the poem doesn't, you don't have to turn the page. And there are poems that are 2 pages that, if you didn't know that it was 2 pages, you might think the poem was over at the end of the first page.
right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and then you turn the
Yep.
page, whoa, wait a minute, this thing's keeping going. So,
Yeah, that
yeah.
happened to me reading books. So I try to make sure my own don't do that. Another question. Your wife often features in your poems, especially in the new poems. Well, actually, all
Yeah.
through the book, all
Hmm.
through your poems.
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed getting to know Colleen as much as you through the poems. What does she think about that?
That's a good, that's a good question. I think, lately, I mean, by lately, I mean the past 10 or more years, I think she feels fine. I think she feels comfortable because I have learned not to breach any privacies that are, truly private, or speak of any feelings and particularly losses that might be more specifically her losses. Um, in my poems as though they were central to me. Um, and I think that when I was a younger person, I would occasionally do that, and then I'd give a reading, and Colleen would hear the poem and feel, be offended by it, be hurt by it, and it was a learning process for me to respect to keep that respected distance or clarity between us. Um, I never show anybody any poems of mine until they're published. I don't share them with Colleen while I'm working on them. I
Oh,
just don't. It's just not my way of. The only person I share my poems with regularly is Jesse Milner. I send him the poem, and basically
huh.
he says thumbs up or thumbs down, and if he says thumbs up, I go okay, and I keep going. He doesn't say, well, sometimes he does, but in general, he just kind of gives me a go ahead, or sometimes he'll say, "You've done this one already. Don't go there," and I do the same for him. But otherwise, I don't really show anybody. But then when the book is in manuscript and it's ready to, or maybe even a publisher has accepted it, then she reads it, and then she really helps with uh, you know, spelling, grammar, things that don't seem clear, because she's a really good reader, but she's not really a reader of poetry. So she can catch the BS, you know what I mean? She can catch the stuff that's not clear. And my goal is always to be clear and to think of my reader as responding to the poems, not write poems that they scratch their heads and say, man, that guy's smart, but I don't understand what the hell he's talking about, which is the
Right.
last thing I would like to do. Um, but it is true that she's in my heart and my mind all the time, and she just populates my being. So she's in the poems. But another thing to say about that is, a lot of times the poems are not documentarily true. They're not exactly what happened, but something happened that spurred the poem. It might have been we walked across a lake and the ice cracked, but the rest of it didn't. Nothing happened. I made up.
Right.
So so she doesn't feel intruded upon, or um, I'm not sure what the word would be. The
Invasion of
I don't want to
privacy.
hurt anybody. I don't want anybody to
Right.
feel that I've intruded upon their own private spaces and pretended they were my own. You know.
Right. Has anyone ever said, "Oh, and you did this or that," and then she has to say, "No, that never happened."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, that does happen.
Yeah.
That happens and I think of it as, and unfairly perhaps, as a certain kind of naive reader who thinks that what you're writing
Right.
about is the quote unquote the
Absolutely
truth,
correct.
and it is the truth. It's the truth. It's just not it's not a documentary of the truth. You know what I mean? It's like the
Yeah.
truth is that
Right.
feeling and that experience, but it never actually happened. Or didn't
Right.
happen
Yeah.
exactly the way it is. It comes alive in the poem. So.
Um, One of my other questions was, you also include your different family members, and I was wondering, because like with my own, I don't think anyone, maybe one person in my family might have actually read any of my books. Do you
Ah,
think your family has actually read your books?
yes, yes, they do. Yes, yes. Uh-huh.
They do.
My son and daughter in particular have always read my work. My daughter actually did a cover of one of my books, a chapbook, a really beautiful cover, and actually her best friend did the cover of a book of mine that came out in 2021 called The Mica Mine. So,
Oh,
and my son is a musician, so he and I actually collaborated quite extensively. Again, about 10 years ago, I would read a poem and he would manipulate it electronically, and then and then set it to music, and it was wonderful. And I would actually like to do that more with him, because he's an amazing musician and we work really well together. So yes, they both really enjoy the poems. I don't know. The only other family member I have that's still alive is my sister, and I don't really know. It's a good question. I'm not sure how much she reads the books. I send them to her, so
yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I do the same. I don't
yeah.
think many people read them. Okay, the next question I had was, many of your poems capture these small, perhaps really rare moments in time. Do you write, like Wordsworth said, emotion recollected in tranquility, or do you have to write that down right away?
Let me think
Like
about that.
perhaps
Okay,
you're observing.
so are you asking? Do I have an experience and then write it down, like almost in the moment, or
Right.
um, how do I work that way?
Does it
How do I
come
work
to
that
you
way? So
much
I'm
later?
gonna interpret your
Right.
question. I'm gonna interpret your question and answer it in the following way. I never keep I never keep a journal, for example, and I never I hardly ever jot down things that I'm thinking while I'm walking, or having an experience. But I'm always aware when I'm working on the writing that stuff is coming out in the writing. So I guess, to answer the question more clearly, I don't um, I don't think of myself as doing the Wordsworthian emotions recollected in tranquility. Um, but I do think that in exploring through the process of poetry, and that is to say, exploring through the process of a cadence that I'm listening to that might distract my sort of more focused mind. those a lot of experiences that are important and striking that have occurred to me, recently, will come into the poem, um, in a transformed way, like they've been cooked a little bit, or they've been worked over a little bit, but not with my intentional self, but mind, but with whatever happens when you have something in your mind that you're not really thinking about, but it's there. So for a long time, I used to give a talk to students in which I talked about poetry as the wild mind. And what I meant by that was, if you write poetry in the way that I do, which is that you kind of have a formal intention in the poem. It's not a sonnet or a villanelle or something like that, but you're listening very carefully to the line. You can that very process can distract, again, as I said, can distract your more intentional mind, and you can start to discover things that you're following, like an animal, like a wilder animal might follow along a path in the woods to come to something that he or she doesn't really know is there, but he senses it or they sense it. And as opposed to a domesticated animal that might, I'm walking out with, and I know pretty soon I'm going to come inside, and my master's going to give me food and whatever. So, you're trying to discover, and you discover things that are within that have happened to you, or you've been yearning for, or grieving, or feeling, in an inarticulate way, until you get the poem.
You're very observant, and so you recall all these details, or you make them up as you're going along. The poem I was thinking of was An Ordinary Morning, but I want you to read Shade. I assume the title refers to both parts of the poem, and I wanted to know, well, I'm going to have you read it first.
Okay,
and then I'll
what
ask
page is
you.
it? I'm looking right now for.
Page 8. Page 8. I
Okay,
wrote down
page
the
8.
page numbers. I was
Okay,
going
yeah,
to ask you.
yeah. You sent me a list, and I wrote them down, but I don't. Oh yeah, this one. Okay. This is a I have some things to say. I can talk about this one. I'll read it first. So, do you want me to read both parts of it, or do you want me to read?
Yes.
Okay,
Mhm.
it's a two-part poem
Right.
called Shade. 1. My mother climbed the rickety ladder into that huge crabapple tree, feeling for worm-free apples we could taste and make something out of, applesauce or pie. The day was cool. My mother was singing, hidden in the tree shade. I was singing too. She threw an apple down at me and laughed to watch me dodge and shriek, then stepped off into the tree and seemed to really disappear, which scared me, just a boy. So I climbed up into the apple-scented shade to find her sitting on a limb, holding apples in her skirt with both hands. How would she climb down that way? And crying softly. Her legs were scratched and streaked with dirt, and her delicate manicured feet were bare. 2. These many years later, I see her standing at the open kitchen window, watching the first birds of spring at her feeder, trying to remember their names, and wishing she could vanish without going anywhere, move out of her body like a breath does into open air. She thinks about the distance those small birds have flown, and since I'm her son, I see her turn away. I see her turn away now and move through the house, touching her furniture, talking to the pictures on the walls, not the photographs of families arranged like a bouquet across her bedroom walls, but the paintings of flowers standing rigid in their vases, a three-masted schooner moving out to open sea. Okay.
I
Well,
double checked.
I had the first part. I had that poem, in my files, so to speak, in my computer for quite a long time, before I realized that it actually rhymed with other poems I'd written, in a strong way, and wrote the second part much more recently, which for me is clear to me because the cadences of the second one are much nearer the cadences I'm writing now, and the earlier one has a different sound to me. Um, and neither one is documentary at all. I mean, I didn't. My mom would never have climbed an apple tree like that, like she does in this poem. But there was there. It's a repeated, like let's say, image for me that my mom is kind of disappearing into something, and then singing to try to to try to act like she's feeling, like try to pretend that she's not grieving or feeling sad, in some way. And I don't understand it because I'm witnessing it as a child, you know.
Right.
Then and so in that poem, um, there's nothing. I don't think there's anything that wasn't made up, so to speak, except for the feeling of the observation of my mother, and trying to understand who she was. Then the second one, um, I can see, is much more documentary in the sense that the rooms I'm seeing are actually from her house. So I see her there, and I could see her. You know, I think she could have been watching. I mean, I could see her watching birds in the feeder in her actual life, um, and I think that that she did feel like she wished she could vanish without going anywhere, move out of her body like a breath does. Um, just because she was alone and lonely, and she had a very hard time connecting with people. And then as she moved in her house, she had those very pictures I talk about at the end. So that's where that poem came
The
from. And one of the things I should say to you, I'm really grateful to you for pointing to for asking me to read that one, because that's one that I just would never. I don't. It's not one that I would just think it's in the book. Okay, great. And now when I read it, I see. Oh, that's got some potency in it. I like it. So thank you for that.
does. And the title to me has so many multiple
Oh yeah,
meanings, both of these, that the shade of the tree, but also your mother being a shade.
yeah.
And I get goosebumps. I just got goosebumps again.
Thank you.
I got goosebumps reading this poem because it reminded me of my own mother. And
Hmm.
also the theme of singing. You have a lot of singing in your books, and your mother sings is one of my personal favorite poems, which I'm going to ask you to read later as we kind of move through the book. But
Yeah.
Shade just really, uh, when I read a poem that really impacts me, I have to go, oh, and
Mm,
I get goosebumps. And so that was one of those poems that just elicited that response.
great.
And
Thank
they
you.
were both so different, yet I could see why you put them together.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well,
Beautiful.
actually, I
It
mean,
was
I
just,
actually think the second one kind of made me say, "Oh, I think I remember a poem from," and I went and looked for it and found it, and so the second one
ah,
called forth the first one from a long time ago.
oh,
So
yeah, yeah. Oh, that's good. Because, yeah, I'd never seen the first one
yeah,
before.
yeah,
Um, I've noticed that sometimes your titles are really evident as to why it's the title of the poem, but in other times, other poems, they're not so obvious. For example, I'm going to name a couple: The
yeah.
Wound, Laid, The Shape of Moving, Extinctions. Those I had to look at those poems very carefully to kind of understand where those titles came from. So
Hmm.
how do you to your titles? Does the
Um,
title present itself and then the poem, or does
yeah.
some
Now, yeah.
emotion?
The title comes after the poem, and in many cases, the title is an attempt to give a different angle on the poem than would otherwise be, let's say, understood. Um, and then many times, I think a title is simply a way of directing the reader into the poem. The one thing I don't want a title ever to be is a label. Like the poem about my dad, and then there's a poem about the dad. That kind of thing. So I'm not sure that I mean, as you say that, I'm not sure that I can explain why I would choose certain titles, after the fact. Uh, but I probably could. I mean, just I but it always, again, it comes, I would say, intuitively, or not. I don't think, like, what should the title be. I don't go, what should I call that poem. it more is just, that's what I call it. I call the
Well, let's,
poem, but okay. So for example, I have a new poem which I'm calling for the time being Grace, and it's a poem about just being with somebody and walking across. It's kind of like the same kind of poem I write often. People are walking across a field, and we see some animals across the field, and it was a nice scene. I liked it, and giving it the title Grace to me gave it a sense of a more numinous quality, like there was something special
yeah.
here that we might look more carefully to find. So,
Well, that could have been the definition of grace. Seeing those
uh,
animals might, you have been
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah, right, right,
definition of
right,
grace.
right.
So in the wound,
Okay,
page
the wound.
10,
Yeah, yeah, okay.
yeah,
Let me get it.
the
The wound.
wound.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll read it. Should I talk about it or read
Yeah,
it and talk about
yeah, read it. No, read it and talk about
it?
it
Okay,
because listeners
okay. Yeah, because they won't
won't
know.
have the
Otherwise, I'll be talking about
right,
something nobody's ever heard. Okay,
right.
this one's called The Wound. Another morning, she knew how to speak whatever languages anyone else was speaking. Wherever she traveled, whomever, whatever she spoke to. Eventually, these languages grew cramped inside her. They rubbed and jostled each other. Their friction started to burn off the secrets where she'd lived until smoke filled the sky of her memories. Fire burned down the house of her earliest days. In the front yard, her parents floated up and away like ashes to drift down in a distant country with another language, where a girl like her woke up on an ordinary morning and knew something was wrong. Still, she lay there listening to her mother putter in the kitchen and her dad whistle softly as he headed off to work. Okay, so to me, the wound in the poem is this moment where the girl wakes up on an ordinary morning and knows something is wrong. And what is that? What is it that she knows something is wrong? What is it that's wrong? What's wrong in a certain way is the loss of a certain quality of maybe we could, for lack of a better word, magic, or something numinous and larger than she, that is, she could speak another language, she could do all these things, she had all these things inside her, and then she wakes up on an ordinary morning and knows something is wrong. Still, she lay there listening to her mother putter in the kitchen and her dad whistle softly as he headed off to work. Either that, or the other the other way of thinking about it is just the griefs and the griefs and the confusions that we hold within ourselves, even as we go around in any ordinary day, as though everything were, we're fine. And I think that moment, it happens when a child becomes almost an adolescence, or I think earlier, really. But there's a time when children are open and free and gloriously alive to the world in a purely innocent way, and then there's the time when someone says, you have a funny way of walking, or you're whatever, and they become self-conscious and self-aware in a way that closes down a lot of those aspects of themselves. Still, when they're by themselves, they can locate those things and find those things. But then at a certain point, there's a wound that closes those things, those abilities off for most people. And perhaps that what I was trying to get at the poem. But then again, I don't know really, except that I think I do like the title, "The Wound," for that poem. It seems to me to get at
It's an
something.
internal wound. Yeah,
And
it's an
if I called
internal
it the
wound.
young, for example, if you called it the young girl or something, forget it. Like it just doesn't carry anything.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, the wound really makes you read it again and makes you
yeah,
think about internal wounds and how our experiences imprint and leave scars, wounds on
yeah.
our psyches, on our
Yeah, and
souls.
yet we walk around and look at each other and pretend that everything's just kind of like normal and life is fine and we're all holding ourselves together, when really, it's much more
Right.
complicated than that.
It's like when you first realize your parents are just ordinary people,
Yeah,
and it's such a shock to
yeah,
realize that they're not, you know, 20
yeah,
feet tall.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
They can't. Like I used to
Okay.
think my dad. I used to think my dad could throw a ball higher than the sky, like it could disappear. And then there's a moment when you see the ball coming back. So
Right. Yeah. And there's something that clicks in your brain that you don't have words for yet, but
yeah,
it's there
yeah.
and it grows. Yeah.
Well,
I
I mean,
really
I actually think that's what poetry is. It's trying to get at those moments of awareness, or those moments of feeling that we don't have words for. That's why we have to make a poem to try to get at it. The poem
right.
should resist paraphrase. I mean, we should not know. We should not be able to say, like, here's what this poem's about. I'm going to tell you. Or, like a 10th grade. Like, I think in 10th grade, I had teachers who would say, "Tell us what this poem's about." And well, I can't tell
Right.
you what it's about. It's more mysterious than that. It's like asking a person,
Well,
tell me what you're about. you know
that's a real good segue to my next discussion topic. Your poems have always had these magical elements to them. Plants growing in your bed, trees in your chest, birds singing only to you. Are you a fan of surrealistic art and literature, or is the way do you view life as a surrealist painting?
Mhm.
Um, are you to me, you seem to always be accessing not only the outer landscape, but your inner landscape. And this landscape is always growing and changing into these magical things. So,
So
so tell me about.
that's a great question. I would say that I'm not that much of a fan of, let's say, French surrealism, the writers or many of the painters. Although I do like, it's not that they just haven't influenced me that much. But the writers who have influenced me would be the Latin American surrealists, or I wouldn't even say magical realists, but the Latin American writers who fused surrealism with a very hard-edged realism. Cesar Vallejo, to give an example. When I was in a second year in college, we were in a class, a poetry class, and the teacher brought out Robert Bly's translation of uh, Black Bones on a White Bone. But I can't remember the exact title, but it was Black Bones lying on a white bones. And it says, "I will die in Paris on a rainy day. On some day I already remember. I will die in Paris, and I do not step aside." And then he says something like, "Why do I know I'll die in Paris? Because today, putting on my upper arm bones, I couldn't touch things anymore. That's the quality of the poem. So it has a surrealism to it, but it's not like just everything is wherever it wants to go. And my eyes teared over. I mean, I couldn't even, like, I was out of time for a moment, realizing that this was something that I could explore. I could go in, I could tell the truth. I could explore feelings of the outside world and the inside world in a way that didn't just document things, but talked about the confluence of the two things, the connections, and the magic, I guess I could say, that is always present and very rarely articulated. So that would be my like, I think, my place, my beginning place. Although as a child, my dad loved poetry, so he read, T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost and people like that. And I always loved The Wasteland. The Wasteland kind of taught me as a child not to worry about understanding anything, just listen to it and you feel it, and understand it through feeling and intuition, or some other part of yourself. But don't worry about, like, what's it actually saying, and paraphrasing it, so to speak. So I would say that's where it began. And then also, as a young writer, a lot of the writers who I think of as having influenced me were also influenced by that Latin American surrealism, like Robert Bly, W.S. Merwin, uh, Charles Simic to a lesser extent, and then many women writers, Denise Levertov, people like that, who didn't follow that direction, but followed something else, which was equally important to me, which was a very careful listening to the cadences in the poem in order to discover the poem. So, not you don't write the poem outside the rhythm or the cadences of the poem. They come together at the same time. So, so it was, I would say, it was those Latin American surrealists and also the Black Mountain poets. And so it's very beautiful for me to live in Black Mountain, North Carolina now. But people like Robert Creeley and Denise Levertov, and someone like Louise Glick, who just died, really powerful, strong poet
Is
for me.
their presence still felt in that area? Do you like feel them there?
Well, yeah, the thing about that is you do kind of, because there's a Black Mountain College museum. We live very close to the first campus of Black Mountain College, and a lot of the landscapes that you see if you look at a catalog of Black Mountain College campus and students and stuff, we are still right there. So that's very much the case. And then there are a lot of people here who are interested in Black Mountain College. So we have conversations about the place, and there is a resonance definitely of that college in, I wouldn't say the general population, but the artistic community here for sure.
Right. Another thing I've noticed about your poems is you often are outside yourself looking in.
Hmm.
For example, wind chime, certain forms of love. I was wondering, do you often feel like an outsider, and so you're kind of have to, you sort of feel yourself outside looking in? And is there a particular group of people that you feel that you're more outside looking
Yeah. Well, you have some great questions. Thank you for these questions. These are I've never thought about that really. But I'm going to, and I probably won't give a very good answer right now, but man, that's something to think about. I don't know. I think it might. I mean, my short answer would, and off the cuff kind of, would be that would be a technique for trying to say something with. Okay. Okay. Now, how do you write a poem that is honest about experience and feeling, and yet resists sentimentality? Um, One way to do that would be to treat the self as something other than, as something that's observed, I think. And instead of, so that you can watch yourself, or you can watch a person who is who is behaving like you might behave, and look at that person as a character and think about that person in that way. I'm not sure that answers the question. I guess the truth is, for me, it might it's more like like a way of getting at the material. I'm not sure. I've always been resistant to the quote unquote confessional poem. I'm also at the same time had a great need to write about things that have happened to me, and people that I love. So how do you fix that?
well
How do you get that?
is is there really a difference between confessional and personal?
I think well,
Like
I don't know. I
you're
think I don't want to. Maybe it goes back to a certain extent to what we said about writing about Colleen, my wife, earlier. I don't want to write things that would disturb her privacy, let's say, that I know about. Any more than in a certain way, I want to write any. I don't want to. I want to write about things in my own self that would disturb my privacy. I want to find a way to write a poem that is very probing of the experience of being a person that I experience, and I observe other people experience without without violating them in any way. And I think one of the things I don't like about confessional poetry, so called, whatever that might mean, is that there's a certain violation of certain privacies that actually can give the poem strength and power, but isn't something that I want to do. Um, think about like Sylvia Plath, or people like
I
that.
was just thinking
That
of Daddy.
yeah, so yeah, I wouldn't want to write a poem like that, because just because I love and respect the people I love and respect, and those are the people I could write in that way about. I just wouldn't. I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. I recognize the power, but I don't want to do it. So
Except that in that poem, none of what she wrote about Daddy was true.
Yeah, I know.
So
Yeah,
it,
I know.
but yet
Yeah,
it's labeled as a confessional poem because of
yeah.
her emotion, but the facts of the poem are not true,
Okay.
which a lot of people mistake. And the same thing with Theodore Rothke's,
Yeah,
the poem
yeah,
about dancing with his father.
yeah.
So
That's
many
beauty.
people think
But
it's
see,
about
to me, that one.
abuse, and it's not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so then we'd have to get into more of a discussion about what constitutes the confessional poem versus the biographically based personal poem, like Rutke's poem with his
Right.
father. I think that I don't. I think there's a definite distinction, and I definitely would want to
I
write
think
more like the
whining.
Rutke poem, than the Plath poem. Although I recognize how important the Plath poem was for our American poetry. Uh,
Right.
um, I don't want to hurt people with like Robert Lowe hurt. He hurt people with what he revealed in his poems, and they may be great poems, but it's not a
Right.
place I'm going to go in my own work, and maybe to the
Well,
detriment of the work. Oh, there's another thing to say though. I also think that for me at least, I want to gain the access. I want to try to make the let's say, call it for lack of a better word, the story in the poem be kind of a universal thing. And certainly the story in Daddy would be universal in a way, but in another way, a lot of confessional poems that I read feel like, well, I'm sorry you had this terrible experience that's yours, that you're telling me about, but it doesn't
right.
rise to the level of the general experience of a human being in the world. It's very specific to
Right.
that particular experience
Right. Right.
or that particular life.
And can be self-pitying and whiny and stuff like
Yeah,
that. Okay, uh I wanted I'm sort of focusing more on the new poems because
yeah,
they're new and nobody
uh-huh.
has seen or heard them before. And your other poems in the book, since it's selected, are, have been around.
Yeah.
So I am sort of more focusing on the new. Read the River, page 20.
Okay.
I wanted to tell you something about that.
Okay. Should I read it first and then you tell me about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
The river. I'm taking a pause from the person I've been for most of my life and starting to enter the man I've been only occasionally, even the man I've only pretended to be, a stranger I've hardly imagined. My wife has decided to do the same. We've agreed to try out our new selves and meet back here in a few days to talk things over, perhaps make some permanent adjustments. Our children might be strangers soon. Our old dog already ignores us. The river that runs by our house has been rising for weeks. We've been cleaning out our closets, tossing things into the swirl, old books we thought we should love, classics that only bored us as they bored everyone for centuries, photo albums full of squinting strangers, dress shoes that pinched, overstuffed pillows that made our necks stiff. And then one morning, a herd of deer tried to swim across to our side. So many hungry animals have been swept away. Even our faces in the mirror seem to have been swept away now by that rising river and by our yearning. I can only be naked, though I'm trying to locate the clothes I wore when I was a man who sported perfect teeth and a full head of hair, the kind who tells the truth when he lies, or vice versa. I can't remember now, though I'm sure it must matter to someone.
So my reaction to that poem was, yes, it matters to me. And when I read that, uh, I said, yes, yes, it matters. And so I just wanted to tell you that, yes, I think people reading that poem would have the same reaction, that, yes, it matters to me. You matter to me. Your words matter to
Huh.
me.
That poem, I mean, I
The
have to
other,
say that one is I would one of the newer of the poems in the new section, and I still don't know it that well in the sense that when I read it, I go, oh, interesting. Okay, nice, shift right there, so it's still kind of alive, and it's a very an interesting process to read poems that in a book like this, particularly because many of them are quite old. um, and even the new ones are, they're more fresh to me than they usually are in a book. I'm not sure why, but they feel
Right. It's
fresher
like reading them written by somebody else
in
and
a
looking,
funny way.
oh,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah, I wrote that. Yeah, I just really love that poem. Nakedness is also another one of your
Mhm.
themes,
Yeah.
is being lost. In a lot of poems, you're naked, your wife's
Yeah.
naked, you're running through the woods, the forest.
Yeah.
Um, what came to my mind was, I wonder if anyone's ever done a dissertation or a master's thesis on the themes in Michael Hettich's work. What a great subject matter that
Uh-huh.
would be for somebody doing one, because those themes, recur quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, and I wondered if the nakedness in your poems reflects your own feeling of vulnerability, which does come across in your poems.
Yeah, I think that is it. I think that's definitely it. Uh, it's funny because a friend of mine, an old friend of mine from high school, reconnected recently, and I sent him this book, and wondering what he would think. And he's an artist, he's a reader, and his only comment was, "Man, you're naked a lot in your poems." That was what he said. Thanks a lot. Um, and and
Well, at
but I
least you
think
know
it's
you read them.
vulnerability. I think it is vulnerability, but it's also, I think some of the newer poems have, I recognize the speaker is getting up in the night at night naked and going outside, and vulnerability and just being in a place, and then that would be an actual, like, I do that, you know what I mean, like that is actually something I do. But then at other times I think nakedness is, yeah, it's like the vulnerability of a body without clothing, you know.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, living in the woods, you can do
Yeah.
that. You don't have too
Yes,
many
you can.
neighbors, except maybe the winter time. There you can see through the trees a little bit more.
Yeah.
Um, the, the title of your book, Halo of Bees, wonderful
Yeah.
metaphor for the whole
Uh-huh.
book. What made you, and there is a title poem, Halo of
Yeah.
Bees. I
Yeah.
don't think I
Yeah.
wrote down the page number for that.
And
But
I don't think that poem really has a halo of bees in it. I'm not sure. But
I thought it did. The, oh,
oh, maybe it
no, the
does. Maybe it
poem,
does. I know it's from a book that whose poems I had a harder time selecting poems from, called The Animals Beyond Us, because it was a book I
right.
wrote in one summer very quickly. I had this idea. I read Linda Gregg, and I loved her work, and I still do. But it seemed to me that what she did often was she wrote a poem very, very quickly and let it just stay as it was. So I had this idea that I'd write a book, and not revise the poems, and I'm usually a big reviser, and have them be a certain, like, I think 4 beats to the line, etc. I had a bunch of ideas about what I should do in this book, and the book came out, and I thought it was pretty good, and then it did not last. Like, the poems seem old now, and they don't seem to quite work. But but to get to the title of, let me see, I'm looking for that
It's
that
page
poem.
100. It's on a
Okay, good.
page
I'm right there.
49.
Good. Well, to get to the title of the book, um, as one day, as a little guy, a young guy, my grandparents had a house in Connecticut, and but they weren't country people. They did, it was like sort of like, it was Stanford. I mean, it was outside Stanford, so it wasn't. But they had a big yard, a big, really big yard. And one day I was just sitting outside, and I saw my grandfather and my dad running across the field, and they looked really angry. And I thought to myself, what, and they were running toward me, and I thought, what did I, like, did I do something? And then I noticed that they had this, like, clouds around their heads, and it looked, I didn't think they looked like a halo because I was just a kid, but it was bees, and they were just trying to escape the bees. And ever since then, that image has stayed with me. And so that was kind of the beginning place. But in terms of the metaphor of halo of bees, it's bees have such rich resonance and suggestiveness, as the pollinators, and most people think of them as something that stings them, So to me, just to see that image of my dad and my grandpa with the halo of bees around their head, and then think about the pollinating quality of that, and the threat of it too, so that to me felt like a very apt metaphor or quality of in the poems I was hoping, so
Yeah,
that
well,
that's how it
there's the
felt.
buzzing.
Yeah, the
Yeah, the
buzzing too.
buzzing in your
Yes,
head of
exactly.
all the words and
And also the beauty
ideas.
of those animals, of those insects, the pollen, all that they do, and the honey that they make, so all that stuff just keeps on going. So it just seemed
Yeah.
really,
Yeah, I
really
thought it was
apt. So the
wonderful
halo of bees, the
for
poem. Let me read it to you. Um,
yeah.
oh yeah, I like this. I think this one's a good one. Let me see. The halo of bees. The jasmine is flowering with so many bees. I thought for a moment some motor was caught in its branches, as its fragrance woke me to a vividness usually available only to those who can still themselves and listen to their blood coursing through their bodies as if their bodies were not them at all, but merely the necessary vehicle, the structure that holds the world intact. Each blossom held a bee which buzzed until nightfall. And what if I'd stood there while a thunderstorm pelted those blossoms to the ground? There are old men huddled under cardboard just outside our neighborhood. There are barefoot women singing as they walk through pelting rain just before morning. And of course, there are the children. So kind of a odd poem, but I get that was the title. That poem was titled "The Halo of Bees." So
Right. And it fits, it's beautiful for the book.
thank you.
Um, the last poem in the book, The Prayer, how do
Oh
you
yeah.
feel about that being the last poem in the book?
I will say that again. Ask again.
How do you feel about the poem, The Prayer, being
As
the
the last
last
poem.
poem in the book?
Um,
Why is it the last poem?
well, I like the poem. I felt very I felt like it was a very honest poem um, for me, because one of the things that happened to me, I'll answer your question in a second, but one of the things that happened to me very, very profoundly was moving here after having lived in South Florida for, I don't know, more than 30 years, a long time, was that that there were stones. I had stones in my life again. And one of the things about South Florida for me was that it always felt like such a temporary landscape, because I really didn't, there were no stones. I mean, there are stones, but it just wasn't, the landscape wasn't defined by stones. So uh, when we first moved here, I did exactly as this poem tells us. I went and I would gather stones, big stones. I could barely carry them, and I'd carry them down um, to border the garden
Well,
and to do.
read the poem.
Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, yeah. I should read the poem. Right, the prayer. If you wander through the woods, okay, I'll do it again. Let me get it better. And it also has the previous poem, which is also about the same subject, really. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
if you wander through the woods collecting stones to border your garden, your path won't follow logic, as might be the case if you were gathering mushrooms or looking for the quickest way home. Some stones are so pale they glow in the woods light. Others rest on last year's leaves as though someone had carried them there and set them down. Still others are so grubby, it's difficult to see what they'll look like once they're clean. Lined up along the path, they look pleased to be admired, and I do admire them every time I walk there. I know stones sing only perfect silence, like the stars, which is why I carry them down through the woods and why I talk to them in my own language as I hold them to my body, as I lay them gently down. So that, I went over how that poem came to me, but as far as why it's the last poem in the book, I I think it represents to me a lot of what my life is like at this moment, or was like at that moment, the moment I wrote the poem, which is pretty recently actually. And also I like the last two lines as a closure for the entire book, and it just feels like a prayer. And I just feel like that's a good place for a book of poems to end. It just feels like the closure of the poem gives us a sense of the closure for the entire book.
To me, the poem, the stones represented your poems, the how
Yeah,
you
yeah,
carry them inside you, pick them up, hold them, look at
yeah.
them. So that's what I thought
Okay,
as
yeah,
the
that's
how you poem. You're laying them down
yeah.
gently. Um, okay, I think the last thing I want to ask you, well, there are two things I want to ask you. What what's a question no one's ever asked you that you wish they had?
That's a good one. What's the question no one's ever asked me that I wish they would?
Like
Whew.
what would you like to say?
So someone asked me. Wow.
I don't mean to
I
put you
might
on
not
the spot.
okay. Did you say you had another question?
Well,
Because
the
I got to think about that one for a second. That's not a question I
well
could
the
just jump back to,
right,
What's a
yeah,
question I
I got
wish
it.
someone had asked me that they never have?
Well, another way of putting that, is there anything you would like to add
Oh yeah, is there anything
to this conversation?
I would like to say, I would like to add? Well, I mean, it's not a question, but it's a gratitude, I guess I would say, to the whole process of working on writing poems, which a- as I've gotten older and older, I've recognized was one of the greatest gifts I ever happened upon. I just started when I started working on poems. That's what I wanted to do, and I knew that that was what I wanted to do. And I'm not sure why, but it answered a deep need and a need to speak and a need not to speak about, in an ordinary, straightforward way. And over the years, practicing poetry all these years, I've come to recognize how much it gives me a grounding and a sense of being, and also a sense of connecting with the past. My dream as a poet is that I'm taking the fire from previous generations and somehow carrying it forward to pass it on to some future generations. So really, my feeling is a great gratitude toward the art of poetry and the inexhaustible art of poetry that has no place in the big world. I mean, it hardly has any place in the big world, and that's another grace that we feel that we get from poetry, because no, it's done only because people love to do poetry, and because that love is a large thing. We want to communicate with each other, but we don't just want to communicate by saying like, "Oh, look over there! Isn't that a neat tree?" Or "I feel bad today." How do you feel? What can you get at that goes deeper than the being we're often aware of even when we're in our own lives? So that's not really a question, but that's something that I find deeply I don't know, important to me, but also something that keeps me happy and alive, no matter what else I'm facing and dealing with. So
Right. So you write more because you just can't imagine doing anything else. You need to,
well,
because you do have a lot to say, and what you say really profoundly affects other people and influences them. I know it does me, and I'm so grateful for your work. Um, and so I would like to thank you for that.
I mean, thank you, and also thank you for our camaraderie over, I don't know how many years, but many years. Uh,
Yeah, maybe 30, maybe 40.
I mean, maybe the question I could, nobody has asked, but is an important one, is what is the community of poetry that sustains you? And one of the things that I could say in that community was the community we had way back in the 80s, I think it was, at Mitchell's
Yeah.
bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, where we all, as young poets, just came together and we shared our work. And we didn't do it in a hierarchical way. We did it in, whoa, that was good. Or, maybe that one needs a little more work or whatever. It was a community in the best sense of the word. And then that community became larger and we moved into our lives. And we didn't necessarily, you and I didn't see each other that much, but we did do things like, read together. Sometimes I remember coming to your class often, and it had this sustaining community that has been fundamental, I think,
Right. And we've expanded it now via Zoom. So,
Yeah,
one thing that the pandemic did for us really was give us this tool, made
yeah,
us use this tool. We didn't just give up and hibernate. We used this technology and we were able to embrace even more people.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's something I've been grateful. One good thing, maybe
yeah,
there are a couple of good things that came out of it, but it did enable us to go to readings in other states without leaving our desk chairs.
exactly.
So
That's
I'm
true.
grateful for that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'm
Well,
and I'm really grateful to you for accepting to do this interview with me.
well, I'm really grateful to you, and I'm grateful, and also to all the poetry community. But really, I mean, in this case, just really grateful to you, and I feel very affectionate toward you, and very grateful, and I feel a love for you. So thank you, and thank you
Mutual.
for this over all these years and these 2,000 miles of distance. Thank you.
Yes, and I will come visit again.